in honor of Barry today, I do want to start with a baseball story. I will say that I love that we are an inclusive spiritual community of all religious faiths and relationship orientations, but I've always wondered about sports. You know, we're inclusive in every other area, but we're kind of fundamentalists about our sports teams, aren't we? But in an act of integration, I do want to let you know that we have a Dodger fan, that's me, a Rockies fan, and a Cubs fan all on stage working in harmony together. Isn't that impressive? So thank you, Carol, and thank you, Barry. You can go now. So the story I want to tell you about is about the great Ted Williams, who played 19 seasons for the Boston Red Sox, hit over 401 years, still known as one of the greatest baseball players of all time, and known for being a little eccentric as well. And Ted was beloved by Red Sox fans, except for one brief period in 1942. This is when America was getting into World War II, and Ted got drafted, and he decided that it would probably be better for the world to watch him play baseball than go to war, so he applied for a deferment. And it was granted, and when the press got a hold of this, they let him have it. The famous Ted Williams became the infamous Ted Williams. And when he showed up for opening day that day and came up for his first at-bat, the crowd booed. You want to play around? Got to get a boo? Boo! Very good. Such nice people, though. And so he got up to bat. He heard all the boos, but Ted Williams, being Ted Williams, he took a pitch and he took it yard. He hit a home run. And the boos immediately turned into cheers. Hooray! Come on, hooray! So the Zero quickly became a hero once again, and it is important to know that Ted Williams would go on to serve in World War II and in Korea and became a decorated war veteran. Yes, and thank you to all of our amazing veterans. But what I want to tell you is something that happened after that game. There was a reporter that approached Williams and asked him, what did it feel like to have all those thousands of people cheering you at one time? To have everyone cheering for you. And Ted replied, it wasn't everyone. There were 2 people in left field and a guy out in right. I could hear them. Isn't that interesting? To have thousands and thousands of people cheering you, but to have the voices that you really hear be those of dissent. Anybody relate to that in their lives? I think there's a sermon there. I know this room may not be filled with a lot of professional athletes, but nonetheless, I think we all have an audience. We're all living this thing called life, playing the game of life, and there's always people watching us. And I hope for you that your crowd is filled with cheerleaders, with supporters and people who want you to do well and love you whether you strike out or hit a home run. But sometimes there's those 2 people out in left and that guy out in right? And it's important to ask ourselves, what voices do I listen most to? Do I listen to those voices of cheering and support, or do I give in to the naysayers? And my message to you today is that there's really only one voice in the crowd that's worth listening to. It can be caught up by a chorus of voices, but it's the voice of your own soul, the voice of your own becoming, a divine voice. And I would argue for all the voices, moment by moment, there's only really one voice that we can hear at any given time. And the greatest gift you can give yourself and your life is to listen to the truest one, the one that speaks most to your heart and speaks most to who you want to be. Our founder, Ernest Holmes, was a great articulator of this divine voice, and I love something he said. He said, the greatest gift life could have made to you is yourself. You are a spontaneous, self-choosing center in life, in the great dream of being, the great joy of becoming, the certainty of eternal expansion. You could not ask for more, and more could not have been given. Do you believe that? I believe those words, but to be honest with you, I wish I knew them a little better. I wish that I could really hear and embody those words at a deeper level. I wish I could really hear and embrace them in my bones and in the beating of my heart. Because it's so easy for me to not hear the divine voice, but to give in to the critical voice, whether it be someone else's or my own. I have to really ask myself, am I listening to the voice that tells me that I'm a divine child of God, or to the voice that tells me that my butt looks big in these pants? Someone after first service said, I didn't know that guys worried about their butts. Yes, we do. We want to have very fine. Do I listen to the voice that tells me that I'm a beautiful expression of life, or the one that tells me my hair looks different? What is different supposed to mean? Or that yellow is a very interesting color on you? Do I listen to the voice that tells me that I'm enough, that I can be what I set my mind to? Or do I listen to the one that berates me, that tells me I'm not enough? Do I give in and surrender to that voice that tells me about a lesser version of myself that could be no further from the truth of who I am? How many of us have lived a false life or become a false self because we've given in to the naysaying or the pitiful outlook of others? We deserve to hear that more divine voice, to live in accordance with it. But it's not just listening to criticism when we give into that critic's voice. What happens is we build powerful narratives for our lives. Negative stories that can keep us for years, decades, and unfortunately sometimes our whole life from living the real life that is waiting for us when we hear and respond to that true voice. I once had a woman see me for some counseling named Crystal. And at first I thought she had a problem she wanted to talk about, but really what she wanted to do was to tell me her core belief about her story and to see if I would believe it. And her core story was, God did not mean for me to be loved. God did not mean for me to be loved. Sounds ridiculous, right? But boy, did she have a lot of evidence for her story. You ever notice that sometimes? People with those hard luck stories, they have a lot of evidence for keeping them. She shared with me that her mom would be abusive. She would get drunk sometimes and she'd say things to her like, you were supposed to be a boy, not a girl. And the reason you're so homely is because you were supposed to be a boy. So there's the ingraining of that story. God did not mean for me to be loved. In her late teens, she did meet a man and they had a child together, but he only hung around for a year or so and then he abandoned both of them. So there again is that story. God did not mean for me to be loved. She dedicated herself to caring for her son. She dedicated and put herself through nursing school. Quite an incredible feat, all with the thinking that I'm meant to give love, to bring God's love, but God's love isn't meant for me. I'm not meant to receive it. She did have a few other relationships with men in her life that kind of moved in and out like the seasons because they subconsciously knew they could come and get love from her, but they didn't have to give it in return. So when they got their fill, they left and would only come back when they wanted more. They wouldn't take that responsibility. So there, again, is that story. God did not mean for me to be loved. And my heart broke for Crystal. I was very sad for her, and I wanted to say that's not true. This is this other truth. But I couldn't take her story away from her. So I could only ask one question. And that question was, what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? What if God does mean for you to be loved? What if God has been working your whole life to try to bring you in accordance with the right people in the right places, but you've been so ingrained in this story that you've missed it? What if God wants you to be loved as much, if not more, than any human being ever brought about by this beautiful world? What if you're wrong? Crystal was only in her early 40s. She still had time. for meaningful love in her life. What if you're wrong? Do any of us have a story like that? A story that I'm too old to do this. I'm not courageous enough to try that. I'm not lovable enough to ask this person out. It's impossible to find meaningful love in my life. And I have one question for you. What if you're wrong? What if you're wrong? Maybe the problem is simply that you're listening to the wrong voices. Maybe the problem is that you've given in to the critics and those negative viewpoints that perhaps you even now give your own voice to in your head, as opposed to really opening your heart, listening beyond the surface criticisms to get to that deeper truth, that deeper understanding, that deeper voice that can tell us who we are and who we are meant to be and why we are in this world at this time and what we are to achieve. I love a definition of purpose that the great Frederick Buechner gave, Christian minister and author. He said, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." Isn't that good? Simple yet profound. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. He goes on to explain, by and large, a good rule for finding out is this. The kind of work God usually calls you to is the kind of work, A, that you need most to do, and B, that the world needs to have done. If you really get a kick out of your work, you've presumably met requirement A, but if your work is writing deodorant commercials, the chances are you've missed requirement B. On the other hand, if your work is being a doctor in a leper colony, you have probably met requirement B, but if most of the time you're bored and depressed by it, the chances are you have not only bypassed A, but probably aren't helping your patients much either. But for me, in order to find that deep gladness, in order to discover the world's hunger, you've got to listen. You've got to listen. For many of us, that deep gladness has been buried by so many offhanded comments, by giving in to those critical points of view, by those voices in the crowd that are ultimately meaningless, and in forgetting that deep gladness, this beautiful world that has produced us and brought us forth because we have something that it needs. Its hunger has also been ignored, and we've missed it in our lives. We've got to listen better. To be honest with you, I've always struggled with those critical voices. Maybe another minister can come up one day and tell you how to get rid of all of those voices. But let me tell you, I remember every bad thing anyone's ever said to me. It's like it's right there. I can experience it while it's happening. And it's so easy to listen and get caught up in. And I've gotten lost in that voice at times. Even as a minister, sometimes I've given a sermon and been at the door, and 99 people come by and say, "Wonderful job, very inspiring sermon." And then one will make a comment about, like, my socks or something. And I'll go home and I'll shut out all of that cheering, all of that good, and procrastinate about the person that told me about my socks that didn't look good or whatever it may be. Do you ever do that in your life? So much support, so much love coming your way, and yet we stop listening to give someone else attention. I know I'm not the only one that does this, because it seems like we live in a society more and more where we put critics in charge of everything. Sometimes it's not the most skilled or prepared people, but the ones that scream the loudest or complain the most. We've got to get back to listening to that true voice. And I have two rules for receiving criticism, because I want to point out not all critics are bad. Some criticism can be good. Maybe my behind really does look too big in these pants. Maybe my sermon could use a little bit of work. But to receive criticism from people, I have two rules. The first is it safe? Do they say, "Hey, Josh, can I talk to you about something when you have a minute?" That's wonderful. If they yell it through a megaphone in a giant crowd, nuh-uh. If they just put it on my Facebook wall, nuh-uh. So I try to say no to that criticism. I'm just not going to listen. The other rule is, are they telling me the criticism with my highest good in mind? Because a lot of people, they criticize you. It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with them pushing you down so that they can lift themselves up. So do they have an understanding of my highest good? If those two rules aren't met, I do my best to ignore that criticism. Now, I know it's hard when it's someone who's really close to you or someone that you love, but recognize that our religion teaches to love everybody, but it doesn't say that we can't choose to love them from a distance. You know, I think I can love you much more outside of this relationship than in it right now. But create those safe boundaries so that we can get feedback. And ask yourself, in life, am I a cheerleader or am I a naysayer? Am I here to uplift everyone in this world, or to put them down in order to lift up my point of view, my idea of being right? You know, any of us can fall into that critical place. And to show that, I want to tell a story about Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, because he's the nicest guy of the world. And he tells a story about falling into being a critic. And Rogers was a minister, and he went to church one day, and he sat down and started listening to the sermon, and he thought to himself, this is the most awful sermon I've ever heard in my entire life. It's the most awful Mr. Rogers impression you've ever heard in your life, too, I'm sure. Yeah, he's reading from his notes. He doesn't seem to have his stuff together. He keeps referring to his behind and telling baseball stories. Oh, nope, wrong sermon. But he's thinking, this is terrible. And the minister finishes, sits down, the music starts playing, and there's a woman sitting next to Rogers, and she turns to him, and she's beaming, and she puts her hands together, and she says, he said just what I needed to hear. Don't you love that? That's the number one rule of ministry, is only talk to one person and hope everyone thinks it's them, you know. But Rogers' realization in that moment was that the woman was better than he was in that moment. He was coming down, trying to lift himself up, criticizing others. And here she was there having an experience that her heart wanted to have, uplifting everyone around her. I'm not saying don't have a critical viewpoint, but make sure you're responding with love. Make sure you're responding with joy. Make sure you're responding with the truth of who you are. And if you don't know what that truth is, listen. Listen for it. The next time you're in a stressful moment, the next time you're facing a challenge, the next time it feels like your heart might just drop out of your body at any given moment because it's been beat up so much, ask yourself, what voice am I listening to? Who is speaking for me? Because that's who's driving my life. And I don't know about you, but I don't want some jerk running my life. I want a divine presence running my life. I want to open my heart to hear that only real voice in the crowd there ever is, if I can sift through all the noise, the cheers or the boos, and remember that I am born of a divine voice. I am born of a divine word spoken into existence. And if I can listen to it and live in harmony with it, I can do anything. That's how powerful that one voice is. It can sound like so many different voices. It can sound like everyone who's ever loved you and encouraged you. But it is a divine and sacred voice. One more baseball story, if you don't mind, about the pitcher Dallas Braden, who in 2010 pitched a perfect game for the Oakland Athletics. Someone on the Athletics got a no-hitter last night too, sports fans. But it was only the 19th perfect game in Major League history. Think of that, over 100 years of Major League Baseball and only the 19th perfect game. They've had 23 now, I think. And it was kind of amazing because Braden was known as a good pitcher, but not a great pitcher. No one ever thought he would throw a perfect game. They don't think the best pitchers in the world are going to throw a perfect game. And Braden was a little bit more known for his bad attitude on the field. He was getting in fights and arguing all the time. And he grew up in Stockton, California, in a tough neighborhood, raised by a single mom who struggled to get by, struggled to feed her child. He suffered through so much and found sanctuary in the game of baseball. and dedicated himself to it as his mom continued to strive to take care of him and to help give him a better life. And in his teenage years, she got cancer. She developed cancer and she passed away. Can you imagine that? A teenage boy already struggling to get by, losing his mom. And so he continued to give himself even more to baseball. Obviously, he did a good job. He found his way to the major leagues with the support of his grandmother, who took him in and raised him. And just before the ninth inning of that game, he looked and connected with his grandmother. They knew that there was a feeling, there was a presence there. And he got that 1, 2, 3 out, and everybody cheered, and Grandma came on, and they embraced one another, and she grabbed onto his necklace, which symbolized his mother. You know, how did Dallas throw that perfect game that day? Was he just really on? Was it the result of the probability someone's got to throw a perfect game sometime? Or was he listening to that one voice? I don't know the answer, but there is one clue in that he threw this perfect game on May 9th, 2010, Mother's Day. Mother's Day. When we open our lives, when we open our hearts, when we open our minds, when we open our relationships, when we open our work and we have that willingness to really listen, it may be a lot of noise that comes by initially, but if you keep listening, what will arise is that endless river, that deep inward knowing that has never stopped speaking its truth. And when you can align with that, you can walk into your challenges, you can walk into your joys, you can walk into everything you do in life, knowing that no matter what happens, at least you're living in alignment with that voice that knows who you are and knows what you're here to do. Are you listening? Are you listening? Not just in a warm and fuzzy experience, but in your challenges, in your difficulties. Are you listening? When we listen deeply and we find that deep gladness, which is that unique place where the divine oneness and our genuine uniqueness come together to create our awesome authenticity in this world. When we embody that deep gladness, it's then that we can begin to listen for what the world is hungry for, what the world is calling us to. Are you listening? Speaking of Earth Day, one of the greatest myths I think we fall into is this idea that we came to the earth from some far-off place. We didn't come into this world, we grew out of it. The world gave birth to us just like it did to the seas and the trees and all of the life of this beautiful world. And believe me, if you don't mind, that I do not think the world brought us forth to be its destroyer, to mistreat it, to try and control it, to mistreat it, and most of all, one of its most beautiful creations, one another. The world gave birth to us because we have something that it needs. Virtues, values, truth. I believe this world gave birth to us so that we could give this world a voice, so that we could speak to it and declare its sacredness and bring it forth in what we do. You never know what the world is hungry for, but if you live in accordance with your deep gladness, with your deep truth, it's going to lead you right there. It may be a kind word to the Starbucks barista. It may be picking up trash. It may be taking care of someone you love. It may be just sitting with a beautiful mountain view and appreciating and giving thanks for this incredible thing called life. But what I can tell you is this world cannot afford for you to be small. This world cannot afford for you not to achieve and be your true nature. Do not allow yourself to stay still and stagnate in the critical voices that were never your own to begin with. But open your heart and your life to find that higher voice. I love what Jean Houston said. She said, "We can no longer afford to become overwhelmed by all the changes going on in the world around us. We have outgrown the small story of our lives and the small selves to which so many have confined themselves. It is time to acknowledge that the universe resides within us. It is time to embrace higher ways of being for a new era. It is time to move through life motivated not by guilt or obligation, but by gratitude and an abiding zest for doing the things that are called forth by living out of our higher purpose." There is a voice out there for all of us. There's a voice inside us all. It may not always speak in words, but it does speak through love. It does speak through that thirst for knowledge. It does speak in that experience of oneness. Clear that palette of all the other voices and allow yourself to settle into that feeling and that knowing that you are a beloved child of God, here to do magnificent things with magnificent people, individually by ourselves and collectively. How wonderful we have this mile-high church, and is not the world absolutely hungry for this teaching? Yes. Is not the world absolutely hungry for how we are an example of treating one another and having good dialogue with one another and opening up our lives and being willing to be committed to our own thriving, even though it's scary at times? Commit to your own thriving. Commit to that voice, not just for yourself, but for this world around you. And when you hold it in your heart and you hear that voice and you live in alignment with it, this world will sing. It will carry that chorus of all of our voices, of all of our truth, and we will live with that kingdom, that paradise, that sacred earth that already is all the time, right here and right now.